This meeting is being recorded.
Hey y'all, welcome to the sixth and final webinar in the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy webinar series. My name is Sydney Cheifetz. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Director for Student Development Programs within the Safe Campuses initiative at Safe Project. So what is Safe Project? Briefly, we are a national nonprofit organization that works to stop the addiction fatality epidemic. So we do this through our four main initiatives: safe communities, safe campuses, safe workplaces, and safe veterans. Simply for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail of what each initiative does, but I strongly encourage you to check out our website. It's safeproject.us to learn more about us and how you can get involved in what it is that we do. Today, we're here on behalf of our Safe Campuses initiative. So the Safe Campuses mission is to contribute to normalizing and promoting recovery and reducing stigma on campuses across the United States. We do this by providing support, technical assistance, and opportunities to students and staff from across the country. Particularly, we're here tonight on behalf of the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy, so welcome to our fellows. The CRLA is an academic year-long fellowship opportunity for both students in recovery and recovery allies. These fellows receive funding and training from Safe Project to create and implement an impact project on their campus related to the addiction epidemic and recovery. Additionally, they attend events like the annual summit that happened this year in DC and the retreat that we're gearing up for this year in San Francisco. They receive mentorship from folks in the field, and they receive training on topics of collegiate recovery, addiction, recovery through this webinar series. So today's webinar is going to look slightly different from some of the other webinars that y'all have attended with us in that we're going to do a brief presentation and we're going to leave time for a panel discussion with the Safe Campuses staff to provide a little bit deeper perspective on the history, present, and future of collegiate recovery. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Robin.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Bilodeau, and I use she, her pronouns, and I work as one of the two student voice liaisons at Safe Project. I was a fellow in the CRLA last year, and I am a person in recovery. I'm a current student, a graduate student at Winston-Salem State University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature, and at the end, we'll try to get to everyone's questions. I invite you all to introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name, your campus, your organization, and why you're here tonight. I am so excited to introduce this evening's speakers on the history and future of collegiate recovery. The Safe Campuses team at Safe Project works to normalize recovery and decrease stigma on every college campus through advocacy, education, mentorship, and networking. Please help me in welcoming Kimberly Boulden, Sydney Cheifetz, and Dunn.
Thank you, Robin. So a brief timeline of how we're going to structure today's conversation. I'm sorry, I'm Kimberly Boulden. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of Safe Campuses at Safe Project. We're going to structure this as a history of collegiate recovery, a present, current state of affairs of collegiate recovery, and a future of the field. And so I'm going to kick things off with where we've been, and I have a lot to get through and not a lot of time, so let's just dive right in. I think it's really important to set the context of this conversation around collegiate recovery within the context of U.S. history around drug use and treatment. And so if you wouldn't mind advancing slide, Sydney, we can go forward to. Okay, so here is a way too brief timeline of the history of drug use and treatment in the United States. But let's start back in the 1850s to 1900s with unregulated markets. Back at the turn of the century during the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of new inventions and new products hitting the shelves. And these products weren't regulated because they were new. We didn't quite know what they did, how they worked. If you have heard, you used to be able to buy heroin, not even over the counter, just off the shelves. And mothers would give it to their children for teething, for colic. The name Coca-Cola is because the original Coca-Cola had traces of cocaine. It was made with the coca plant. And so from the 1850s to 1900s, there were lots of products hitting the shelves that we didn't know a lot about. This includes cosmetics at the time. These cosmetics had traces of lead poisoning. We know that the paint had lead at the time. The wallpaper had lead at the time. And so there were all of these products hitting the shelves, and consumers weren't really aware of how they worked, what the long-term effects were. It wasn't really until in the 1914s that we have regulation with the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act. And this act said that we were going to restrict and regulate the access to drugs. The drugs were classified, and you could only have access if a doctor wrote you a prescription to treat a legitimate illness. Now, does that mean that access to drugs changed overnight? No. What changed is who had access and how. Think about who had access to care. And if you think about what a legitimate illness is, that has evolved over time. Back at the turn of the century, you could get a prescription for opioids to treat your hysteria if you were a wealthy white woman. And so the access may have changed, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have these drugs in our society. Treatment at the time was, I don't think we would recognize it as treatment today because we didn't understand addiction or treatment. The course of action was to just take individuals and remove them from society. This is sort of the heyday of institutionalization, sanitariums, psychiatric wards. And so people were forcibly removed from society and sometimes forcibly sterilized. The access sort of culminated with the movement of the progressives at the turn of the century to advance prohibition. Prohibition made alcohol illegal in the United States from 1918 to 1933. But if you think about the parentheses around that time frame, there was plenty of alcohol in the United States. That's the Roaring 20s. Think about speakeasies, the Great Gatsby, all that we know about that era and the Great Depression even. So again, this isn't a time where there isn't access. It's just access for whom and by whom. At the end of Prohibition, we see the rise of treatment maybe as we would know it today. Alcoholics Anonymous started in the 1930s. Hazelden opens in 1949. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, we see the proliferation of more types of maybe classical treatment programs. And I would say that a lot of these treatment programs are basing their approach to the rise in the medical model. So you might have heard that maybe in the 1800s, early 1900s, that addiction was a moral failing. It was seen as a personal issue. We start to see this rise in the medical model, this belief that addiction is a disease. And unfortunately, this rhetoric was supported by big alcohol and big pharma because it helped their narrative. It wasn't that their products were addictive. It was that there is a disease that affects a small percentage of society. And so rather than restrict access to everyone, we should continue to regulate, open doors, but treat the disease for those that might succumb to it. The 1990s is when we see the emergence of other pathways. Smart recovery hits the scene in 1994. In the late turn of the century, so late 1900s, harm reduction really takes off. And this comes from effective grassroots practices that came out of navigating the AIDS crisis. And we applied that to these other spaces and sort of thought, how can we, rather than mitigate substance use or prohibit use entirely, how can we mitigate risk and harm? I do want to point out that throughout history, we have used drugs as a racialized vice and as a boogeyman to point blame against other populations. So you'll see in the 1870s, I have this piece about anti-opium dens. Again, the 1850s to 1900s, we have almost unregulated use. And so it's not as if people didn't have access to heroin and opium, but there was this fear as Chinese immigrants came to the United States to work on the Transcontinental Railroad that they might corrupt the existing Americans. And so the drugs are used as a way to stoke fear and to stoke anti-immigrant sentiments. We see the same anti-immigrant sentiments pop up in the mid-1930s, but against a different group. This is targeting Hispanic immigrants, mostly immigrants coming across the border in the wake of the Mexican War of Independence. And you'll see I have here that Henry Anslinger passed the Marijuana Tax Act. And I do want to just make a quick note that up until the 1930s, marijuana was referred to as cannabis by almost everyone colloquially. And Henry Anslinger was very clear and open that he called it the Marijuana Tax Act and not the Cannabis Tax Act because he wanted to associate it with these newly arrived immigrants. He believed that drug use was not something that was problematic for America's existing communities, but that these new waves of immigrants were bringing this vice with them. And of course, this rhetoric sort of comes to a boil in the 1970s with the war on drugs. And I've dedicated a whole slide to that. So we want to advance. I have a quote here from John Ehrlichman, who was President Nixon's domestic policy chief. He says, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And so if you could just go back one time, Sydney, to the previous timeline, just take a look as we move forward and keep in mind who's making the policies and for whom are they making them, who has access and who doesn't have access. So let's move forward to collegiate recovery. This is a very brief timeline of the history of collegiate recovery. I want to point out that this timeline starts in the 1970s. A professor who was in recovery himself wanted to bring recovery to his students and started a 12-step meeting on Brown's campus. Rutgers and Texas Tech, their programs were started shortly after, and they were also faculty-started programs. This changes in 1990s when Augsburg students petitioned their leadership for a collegiate recovery program. So we see the shift from purely faculty-led programs to now some student grassroots movements. In the 2000s to 2010, we see the professionalization of the field as the Association for Recovery Schools and the Association for Recovery in Higher Education come on the scene. Unfortunately, it isn't until 2005, so almost 30 years after the first collegiate recovery program, that we see our first community college CRP hit the stage. And then in the 2010s, an organization called Transforming Youth Recovery starts giving out seed grants to institutions, $10,000 awards to schools that wanted to start programs. So we see maybe 3 different ways that programs got their start in the early stages. Either a faculty would start a program or students would start a program. And now we have grant-funded programs. Colleges see that there's money and resources to do this work, so they step into this space, even if they're, not quite sure of what it might look like. I will say that we hit the 100 mark, or we passed the 100 mark for the count of programs in 2013. There are 4,000 unique college campuses across the country. We're probably at 150 to 200 collegiate recovery communities nationwide today. So it's still a very small percentage of the number of college campuses nationwide. Next slide, Sid. I don't want to exclude another narrative around higher education that's sort of happening concurrently with this movement for collegiate recovery. If you think about the 60s and 70s, these are spaces, or these are times when we have new spaces emerging on campus, like Black student unions and LGBTQ student associations. These are spaces that are started as safe havens to protect students from microaggressions that might happen at the broader campus at large. And so not only do these spaces act as a refuge for students from these microaggressions, but they're also a signal that an institution values you and is committed to your presence. It's one thing for an institution to say, yes, we'll accept a student in recovery to our campus, and quite another for them to say, not only will we accept a student in recovery, we've got dedicated space, dedicated staff, and a budget to help you succeed and to meet your needs. So these identity affirming spaces of collegiate recovery have this history that I just outlined in terms of how they got started, but I don't want to erase the narrative of all this other work that really validates students' identities and how they show up to campus that's happening alongside it. Next slide, please. And so just sort of putting all of that context of American history towards what we're talking about today, if you think about it, the collegiate recovery field is fairly recent. If we take a look again at this question of who's devising programs and for whom, we see that the nature of how programs were started, who has access to programs, what schools have programs, that's shifted over time. I do want to point out that we are talking about the war on drugs happening concurrently to the rise of collegiate recovery. And so as this movement is gaining steam, we're still seeing mass incarceration. You can see the numbers on the slide here. People incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses was 50,000 in 1980. We octupled that number. I'm not sure what the word would be. By 1997, we hit 400,000 people incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. In 2009, we hit our peak. As a country, we are slowly coming down, but I will say very slowly. And so collegiate recovery, while we are on our own campuses and working with students, we can't talk about this work in a vacuum and not consider the context for the entire history of America's drug use, approach to treatment, approach to recovery, and who should have access to recovery. And so I share all that to set the stage for Sydney, and I'd like to pass it off to her. And she's going to give us an overview of, okay, that's where we've been. That's the stage. Where are we now?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. All right, y'all. Sorry about that. So where are we now? What's the current landscape of collegiate recovery? Well, when we talk about the field of collegiate recovery, what is the field? Well, really, it includes thousands of students, support staff, mentors, allies, researchers that really every day are learning more and more about recovery and what it looks like, what it can look like, and all of our collective power and experience. So it's important to note that collegiate recovery is still young, and yet it's blossoming, it's evolving every day. And all of us that are here today are really change makers in helping it evolve. So the field of collegiate recovery is anchored in the development and the progress of students that are in recovery, but also in folks on campus that are impacted by addiction, whether they're in recovery or recovery allies, support staff across campus, those with loved ones, et cetera, and the environments that shape all of us, and our collegiate environment being a large environment that does such. And it's important to note that through what we're talking about, what we know to be true is that when we serve marginalized populations, when we serve those that have been historically and often intentionally disenfranchised, such one example would be students who are pursuing or considering recovery, we all benefit. All of our systems and all of our communities benefit in that. So a little bit on the models of collegiate recovery, and potentially you've seen this, but when you see the acronym CRP or CRC, we're going to talk a little bit about collegiate recovery program. So these are programs that are offered by institutions of higher education that provide safe and supportive learning environments for students that are in recovery from substance misuse or substance dependency. Their primary components, whereas they can all and very much do all look different, are often these mutual aid support groups, and we're going to talk about that. A physical space for students to gather and build community and seek refuge with each other, institutional acceptance and support of the collegiate recovery community, right? Institutional buy-in by administration, et cetera, staff, counselors, or student leaders. So this can take the form of kind of a full-time or a part-time collegiate recovery coordinator. It could be a student leader, it could be a counselor at the health and counseling office. Some sort of a staff counselor or student leadership is very important in that. And then also peers, recovery coaches, counselors, and formal or informal recovery support. So when we think about collegiate recovery communities, these are efforts really energized by students to create recovery supported learning environments at institutions of higher education. So their primary components, and again, they all are going to be very unique, but they often have these mutual aid support groups, and we're going to talk about what that looks like. These are students and other committed individuals who gather. Sometimes they gather socially, they gather as an alternative to the collegiate environment, and sometimes the hostile environment that can often be for folks that are kind of in or exploring recovery. They gather to seek and give support, and they provide peer recovery support, whether that's kind of formal, trained peers or less formal peers. But what we know to be true is that both collegiate recovery communities and collegiate recovery programs, really the basis of collegiate recovery, has been non-clinical in nature, right? For those of us that are in recovery or close to recovery know that it is so often people with similar lived experiences that are really empowering us and keeping us on this pathway of recovery. And we can think of these as comparable to similar identity-centered spaces that exist on campus or exist in our communities. So for the purpose of our work, I want to acknowledge that collegiate recovery is so much larger than collegiate recovery communities and collegiate recovery programs. And we're going to talk about what that looks like and particularly how it pertains to the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy. But for the sake of some of the data that I'm going to show y'all now, we're talking formal CRPs, CRCs. So to jump into a little bit of our data here, this data comes to us from the Transforming Youth Recovery Census from 2017. So what did this large census essentially show us? Well, it showed us some common practices of various collegiate recovery programs. So it found that let's round up, 71% of collegiate recovery programs provide advocacy efforts for student needs, right? So the program is advocating on behalf of and with students for what it is that they need socially, academically. Students are vocalizing, here's what I need, and the program is really advocating for that to administrators across campus. Another common practice is sober social activity. So I'm sure y'all potentially have heard of these. It can take the form of sober tailgates or sober movie nights, sober pumpkin carving activities, but really sober alternatives, right? Because we know that sometimes a theme on college campuses can be substance use. And we want to create sober and safe alternatives for students that want to be part of the collegiate experience, want to have community and be part of that experience, but they don't want alcohol or other drugs to be present for that. Another common practice is 50% of these are registered student organizations, be it a student club or something else, but 50% of them are registered. Another common practice is this idea of peer mentoring. So this can be kind of formal peer mentoring, folks that have received training in recovery coaching or peer mentoring, or just peers that are using their lived experience and active listening skills and to be stewards of recovery for those that are close to them, if that's a mutual understanding that both parties agree with that. 54% of collegiate recovery programs attend conferences, whether this is the Association of Recovery and Higher Education Conference, potentially a NASPA Strategies Conference. Over 50% of them have a presence at conferences. 66% have mutual aid meetings of any kind. So I said we're going to talk about this. It's important to note we're going to talk even more about this, about the diversity that exists and the possibilities of different types of mutual aid meetings. So on college campuses, this can take the form of maybe 12-step meetings, AA, NA, et cetera. It also often looks like kind of an adapted all recovery meeting that's a little bit more inclusive. It can also be a recovery Dharma meeting. It could be a mindfulness-based meetings, but 66% of collegiate recovery programs have some sort of a mutual aid meeting. And last but not least, they found that 74% of collegiate recovery programs are having awareness events, right? Awareness about substance use disorder, awareness about recovery, awareness about how they can and do serve students, the way that students can be involved, but they're really getting themselves and the message out there. So a little bit more as far as what do we know about the field. Again, this data comes to us from the Transforming Youth Recovery 2017 census, but what they found at that time is that 11.8, let's round up to 12% of respondents indicated that their collegiate recovery program had a minimum abstinence requirement. With that, we know then that 76% of programs did not have a minimum abstinence requirement, but I want to hold space here for the acknowledgement, and a lot of tying in what Kim has talked to us about is I encourage us to think about when there is a minimum abstinence requirement to joining a collegiate recovery community or a collegiate recovery program, who is that leaving behind? Let's say I have 5 days sober or 5 days on my recovery journey, and I'm really looking for something. I'm hungry for recovery and I just need a little bit of help. And I go to my campus and they say, hey, Sid, sorry, you need 6 months before we feel like you're a good fit for our community. What does that do for me and my recovery? We know that belonging and being part of the community is so integral in recovery. So I really encourage us to think about what do minimum abstinence requirements do? Who are they leaving out? And who is that centering then, right? Is that providing more privilege to those that had the privilege of accessing recovery at an earlier date? We know that 40.9, let's say 41% of respondents indicated that they had a designated space only available to participating students. So this could be a house on campus, an entire building, a room on campus, but they had a dedicated space. 28% though have space that's shared with other groups, but is consistently available to students. We often hear how important this space is. And we've talked about often students in recovery will share that the larger university context and university environment can sometimes be hostile to folks that are trying to make these quite large behavior changes. And they really find refuge and safety and community in this collegiate recovery community. And so much of that is this space where they can walk in, they can be themselves, they can be supported, and in the presence of people that get it. A little bit more data for us. And Kim talked about this, but really, how many of y'all have heard this quote over and over again of collegiate recovery is so important so that people don't have to choose between their recovery and their education? And certainly there's a piece of that, and we're going to talk about it, but really collegiate recovery can and should exist because we deserve it. We as people in recovery deserve it. With that though, something that we know to be true about collegiate recovery programs is that they aid in retention and graduation. So the national GPA of students that are involved in collegiate recovery support is a 3.18 to a 3.37. The national retention rate is 70 to 90%. There's elevated graduation rates, and nearly 88% of students in collegiate recovery programs do not return to use. With that, we know that belonging in community, right? These folks that get it, we're not alone anymore. That is such an integral piece of collegiate recovery. And we know that students, when they're looking for an institution of higher education to go to, 36% of students said that they would not have attended their chosen school if it didn't have a CRC, because they know how important that support is to them during their collegiate experience. Okay, so what and whose needs therefore are not being met? Well, we're going to talk more about this when we talk about the future of collegiate recovery, but just to touch on it, potentially who's not being met is these multiple identity exploration, right? So what we know to be true, this comes from a 2014 national survey on the characteristics of students that participate in collegiate recovery programs. This slightly outdated, but 2014 study showed that 91% of students that are involved in collegiate recovery programs identify as Caucasian. So I encourage us to reflect on, why is that? Is that because students of color, other marginalized identities do not see themselves in that space? Why is that? What is it about the history and the ways that we're currently operating our collegiate recovery spaces that makes it so that students don't see themselves there? And what are we going to do about that in the future? Because we're shaping the future that we want to see. Last, I'll talk about deepening multiple pathways. So when we talk about pathways, we talk about multiple pathways to recovery and then pathways of recovery. So pathways to recovery can be mutual aid meetings, right? So my pathway to recovery could be NA or a 12-step meeting. My pathway to recovery could be Dharma recovery, right? So a Buddhist recovery pathway. My pathway to recovery could be formal treatment. But really, we need to celebrate all pathways to recovery. However someone got here, if they want to be here, we should celebrate that, because there are so many humans and all of us are going to need something different. Also, a key component is celebrating pathways of recovery. So I would advocate that we really need to move away from this idea of a gold standard of abstinence-based recovery is the best form of recovery. Again, because who is this leaving behind? Students that are pursuing harm reduction as a form of recovery should also be celebrated. Students that have moved away from using the substance that they had a challenge with, but choose to use other substances, if that is what that person chooses for themselves, we should celebrate this, because at the core of collegiate recovery and really recovery in as a whole is autonomy. And so if we respect multiple pathways of recovery, we really respect human dignity and human autonomy. Okay, a little bit briefly, what are some of the unmet needs? Therefore, harm reduction, education, awareness. How often are we having broader conversations about harm reduction on our campuses, fentanyl testing strips, et cetera? Identity exploration, we talked a little bit about that, but is there space for this in collegiate recovery communities? And if not, why is that? How have we set up our communities in such a way that that's not prevalent? Academic support, many schools have this, some schools do not, but really this can look like early enrollment. But some of the unmet needs is there a possibility for academic support for students in recovery that need it? Sober housing is a big one. Some collegiate recovery programs have this, some do not, but we know, according to I think it's Betty Hazelton Foundation, that one of the 4 pillars of recovery is a safe and stable place to live. And for so many students that are in recovery, this includes sober housing on their campus. university support and policy support. So this can be administrators, faculty, staff being aware of collegiate recovery and celebrating that with students. It can also be policy support. So what do our policies as it pertains to the conduct office say about substance use, and is that supportive of or stigmatizing of folks that use substances and recovery pathways? Community support, right? So how can we ensure that the larger context of higher education is supportive of people in recovery? So ideally, they don't need to step into a collegiate recovery community in order to feel safe and welcome. And then again, we talked about this, the celebration of multiple pathways, be it to recovery or of recovery. So I encourage us as we move forward into the future of our discussion to think about what even is collegiate recovery? What is it? What is it not? I just encourage you to reflect on this because all of us are change makers and we really get to be stewards of what we want recovery to look like, what we want collegiate recovery to look like. So it's on us. I'm just going to share some brief data before we jump into the future, which is a little bit of data on the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy. So this is past impact projects for the fellows in the room. Y'all are gearing up to submit your project summaries. But you can really see a difference in what students have chosen to focus on for their impact projects from year one, when we first started the CRLA, to year 4. So in year 1, we can see that 41% of the focus of student impact projects were on CRP. So creating or sustaining collegiate recovery programs, collegiate recovery communities on their campus. We also know that 34, let's round up to 35% of impact projects focused on public awareness, and to a smaller extent, naloxone distribution, research, and other. What we see then in year 4 is that some of these projects have really skyrocketed, right? So we've seen a decrease in students focusing on collegiate recovery programs. We have seen a major increase in naloxone distribution, folks, student fellows choosing to focus on that. Also, public awareness has decreased, and fentanyl testing and providing fentanyl testing strips to folks and other harm reduction strategies has greatly increased. This is because students are stewards to what it is that they want to see in collegiate recovery. They really should be taking survey of what's happening in their communities and on their campus and adjusting accordingly based on their impact project. So as we said, collegiate recovery is so much larger than the programs that exist. And I think that this Leadership Academy data really shows that students are leading the charge as they should. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dylan to introduce himself and move us into the future.
Yeah, so I'm Dylan. I use he, him pronouns. Sydney and I do the same job, but I focus on the professionals. And just to quickly start, it's probably confusing for some folks why we would have done the last webinar on the foundations of this work. And the simplest way I can explain that is that none of us have the answers to it. And so to start with this would mean that we have the answers to it. And we're just going to instruct you on how to do this work. But that's what none of us do. We often do our work through asking meaningful questions and really digging into the heart of what we do, which is why history and how we got here is so important. So I'm going to go through a little triplet of critical issues that I talk with professionals with all day long, and use those questions to shape kind of some forward-thinking thoughts. But again, not here to give you the answers of what the future is going to look like, more help us together shape what we should be thinking about as we look towards the future. So the next slide, the first one will be this question that you would think we have actually settled on by now, but we actually really haven't, is the question on what is recovery in the first place. We're still actively grappling with how do we include multiple pathways of recovery in our definitions. If we have much of our recovery coach training nationally defines recovery or says someone's in recovery whenever they say they are, how do we create a field around that? Because we want to be inclusive about that. But it's hard to create very kind of linear answer-based ways of doing this work when we're not there. And so we have to really constantly be reminded to get back to basics of what is the heart and soul of recovery. And so I will often work with folks to think through some seemingly simple questions, but get them to be honest with themselves about their answers to them. And so as all of us in this call are being leaders in this work, thinking about what comes to mind when we think of recovery? How do we assume someone's starting their recovery journey? Are we assuming because of your experience, they're doing it within treatment maybe, or are they doing it alone? Just what are the kind of the initial thoughts that you have? Similarly, what are the bounds of what recovery does or does not include? Some of us, moderation is very obviously within the bounds of recovery. And some of us, that's a challenge for us to think of it that way. And we just it's about being honest about that first and then challenging it, right? The third one on the slide here is what is the role of treatment? Again, I did not grow up in a world where folks I knew went to treatment, they went to prison. And so treatment support is not a way that I frame collegiate recovery, even though a lot of campuses do. And so I've had to learn a lot, and also learn to work with those folks and make sense of it. And so that I can meet them where they are as professionals and as systems. And then, as Sydney and Kim both mentioned already, is what frameworks are we thinking through, particularly about, when we're thinking of pathways of recovery and pathways to recovery. A lot of us will have our pathway or our meetings that we go to and say, that is what recovery is. But I've seen a lot of programs get started in 12-step ideology, for example, and then they have students, a sudden wave of students that are like, hey, that wasn't my pathway. And then what do those programs do? Hopefully they're willing to be flexible, but sometimes it's a really challenging moment. And so how is our field set up to understand that? I believe by first understanding how we define recovery in the first place. And then the upshot of all of this, and as Sydney mentioned, the research we have to use is old, because a lot of the research that comes out is very specifically about very particular ways of defining recovery. And so recovery research will often just be about abstinence-based 12-step recovery. But if all of our students aren't in that pathway, how do we apply that research to them? We can't. And so how do we, again, get a good sense of what our definitions are so that we can do research that applies to all of us? So next slide is some very quick questions here to get through these slides. The first one is just, as Kim dug into really deeply, is what is our field's relationship to people who use drugs? The history, we talked about it. The challenge is how do we acknowledge that history and create the future? I have argued and do argue with folks many days that our work is rooted in exclusion. And so a lot of students go through Leadership Academy and we join them in this idea that like, this work is super frustrating because the reality is like, what does it mean to do work in a college campus that is a privileged space, trying to bring people who have been disposed of by society in a lot of ways? How do we bring them onto campus where they're going to receive messages that they don't belong, and we're going to build a program for them? How do we do that without being even more exclusionary, especially when the easiest things to do are to be more exclusionary? And so we talk a lot about being rooted in service and how does harm reduction help us do that? We find that being rooted in harm reduction helps us narrow the gap in that exclusion. And then the third piece here is in what is the role of substance use disorder or substances in general in our systems of oppression? Again, not to repeat everything that Kim said, but we have to, if we're going to have a conversation, let's at least be honest about it first. How do we get here? What are we trying to avoid? Or what are we trying to then take advantage of moving forward? What solutions have our communities already found for things like stigma and survival and health? And how are we not going to how are we going to acknowledge where these things come from while also acknowledging where stigma comes from? And the simplest way I can explain this is just being clear and being honest with folks. Of like, if they're saying stuff and they're kind of like speaking through their teeth of saying stigmatizing things, can we stop for a second and go, let's have a conversation about why we believe we believe things like that, particularly on a college campus. Yep. So then the thing, of course, we have all said so far that the folks in this meeting, we are the future of collegiate recovery, particularly students in the Leadership Academy and the students you're going to continue to serve moving forward. They are the future of collegiate recovery. And so there's a couple of things that we often consider folks to think about, or we encourage folks to think about. The first is, what is the relationship between your addiction and recovery and the recovery movement in general? It is very easy to take, I'll use myself as an example. It's easy to take my story and say that that is the movement. It is my job for the rest of my life to just tell my story over and over and over again until it gets generalized to everybody. But we know that doesn't work. And so when we get exposed to the recovery movement, the scale becomes very, very large very quickly. And it becomes about things like insurance and healthcare and like treatment as a system and policy and law. And Robin and I have conversations all the time about how frustrating that is, but it is even more frustrating when it only feels personal. So how do we then understand our own role as an individual, but also seeing ourselves in relationship to systems, and find community to cope with how frustrating that can be? And the second part of this is just continue to find folks that challenge you, that can help you kind of broaden your perspective, that can help raise awareness. Mentors are really important in this field. I was talking to folks a couple of days ago about how the questions that we often find to be so revolutionary and new, a mentor of mine sent me a picture of him asking those exact same questions in 1985. And I was like, well, this is embarrassing. I've been acting like this is new for my entire career because I didn't know better. And that's not a knock on me. It's just that I was so passionate. I just kept marching forward and forgot to give credit to where we came from. And then try to find ways to be a bridge between recovery, addiction, and the other things you care about. This work is hard to keep in a little bucket because we say in the recovery allyship trainings that allyship is expansive. And so if I'm also passionate about the criminal justice system and I'm just as passionate about that as I am recovery and treatment, I can find a good way to connect those and make sense of how I can be even more effective as opposed to try to split myself and my passions in half. And all of this gets us to this really confusing place where we're asking the question of what is the actual goal for the future of collegiate recovery? And my answer is, I don't know. Some of us will say we want to have a program on every campus. As someone who tries to help folks create programs, I don't know if that's actually the answer. I don't think it's the answer to all the problems we have for sure. But the question is then what is the answer? That's why we're all here together today. And I know that can be frustrating, but that's the point. Is this work is frustrating, and that's why we keep doing it. So we'll keep going slide wise here. And then just the final message I send to everybody in these conversations is a message that was given to me when I was a student, especially when I was frustrated, was to pay it forward. Is that it's very easy to kind of gather a lot of support and resources and access to things and say, but still I can't fix it. What if I kind of let go of some of those and pass them out to folks who don't have those yet? Because I didn't get here on my own. I'm sure most of us here did not get here on our own entirely. And so if we're going to enter higher education, especially higher education as a space of privilege, can we keep a hand open to bring someone with us? Can we keep the door open? If someone slipped us a key 5 years ago, can we throw that key back to somebody else or sideways to somebody else so they can enter a room that you couldn't last week or a year ago? So that we can keep infiltrating this broken system that we're all trying to fix day by day.
Thank you. All right, so we want to hear from the Safe Campuses team about the present and the future of collegiate recovery. Kim, Sydney, and Dylan, could you provide your perspectives on just a few questions? The first question is, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for collegiate recovery in the coming years?
One of the things that I hope we're really driving home, and maybe we're not, so if that's the case, let us know in the chat. But we believe that the people most impacted by this work should be driving the work forward. And so it's hard to say what the opportunities in the coming years will be because you all are the future of this field, and you may see a need on your campus that from where we're sitting on this, policy mountain, we don't see because your boots on the ground, you're working with your communities, you're working with fellow students to hear what it is they need. And so I think that Dylan did a really great job of outlining some of those questions for, how can we expand collegiate recovery from not just recovery, but turning towards stigma against substance use in general, and how we can really combat that stigma as, not to use Reagan's terms, but like public enemy number one, and not sort of use recovery as a way to exclude ourselves from that broader community and that broader conversation. That's one opportunity I see, but I really do think that my perspective is not as important as the perspective that you all have. And that perspective is going to change from community to community. I live in New York State. What the folks in my backyard need is probably going to be very different from what the folks in Florida might need. And so honoring that we're all coming from different geographic makeups, different population demographics, and what that might look like.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add besides just thinking about, I think collegiate recovery communities and programs can be used to promote belonging. I think it's a really hot topic issue on campuses now, right? We saw both in post-pandemic, but also just in the fabric of higher education, so many people feel like they don't belong and don't see a space for themselves. And that's so integral in collegiate recovery, and that we know students benefit from that, particularly in recovery. So my hope and an opportunity I see is for collegiate recovery to promote belonging, both in students that identify as in recovery and just in a broader campus. And then also, I think there's so much opportunity there for collegiate recovery programs to be leaders in promoting healthy coping strategies, promoting healthy lifestyles to other folks on campus. I think folks in recovery have had to think long and hard about what is wellness to them and what is good for them and what are the ways that they're fueling themselves and how are they coping. And so I think there's really opportunities for this to be shared with the broader college context, because we all need it in our higher education settings.
An interesting conversation I have and a lot with folks at conferences, so Sydney and Kim have seen me do this kind of trick a lot in presentations, is I'll just share the definition of recovery by SAMHSA, which is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And I just ask higher education professionals, like, who of you think you already do that work? And they all think they already do it. And so like the challenge for me is that I would love for folks to just realize that if colleges are doing their job, period, this is not a conversation we need to have unless we want to have a cool space where folks in recovery can celebrate each other. Let's go. Let's party, right? But the fact is, I think recovery becomes a place where we see the general failings of higher education. And so, yeah, I think it's an opportunity for us to hold, as us in this room, in this meeting, and also us who care about this work, to hold a mirror up to colleges and universities and community colleges and everybody, and just be like, but why? It's like, why are we having these conversations? And it often boils down to stigma and just histories of other issues being blamed on substances. And so it's hard to balance that with the fact that I don't want to take the focus off the fact that students in recovery are incredible, badass people and deserve direct support. But the fact that we need to have the conversations the way that we're having them is often frustrating to me.
Thank you. For the next question, we wanted to talk and see your opinion on what you think collegiate recovery programs need to focus on or shift away from.
I'm gonna go first on this real quick because I have to jump after this question. But the soapbox I'll try not to get on right now is I often struggle when programs are started with the idea of collegiate recovery as an extension of treatment, where folks are in treatment and then they're recruited out of treatment to go to college so that the collegiate recovery program can serve as a continuation of that support system in that same way, which for me is hard to see, because my favorite part about college, whether it was my experience or the experience that I got to share with students that I was working with, was seeing them reclaim their agency. I didn't grow up with a whole lot of choice in my life. And so going to college was like, oh shit, I get to like go and live and have fun and like find the friends I want to find. But often, because there's this lack of trust for people who have any experience with addiction, we then try to rob them of that heart of the college experience just for the sake of them graduating, because their parents want them to graduate, or the treatment center wants to pad their numbers, or whatever it is. When like I would rather risk a challenging time than rob a student of the heart of the magic of the college experience, I find. And so how do we balance, of course, safety and inclusion with the heart and soul of belonging and living a self-directed life, right? So yeah, I hate that we have to kind of make that choice sometimes with folks.
I guess I'll jump on that and say, if we think back about the history of these identity affirming spaces, right? I think James just put in the chat that their campus doesn't have a collegiate recovery program. That's okay. I think too often we see a collegiate recovery program as mission accomplished. We've created this space, this safe space for students on campus. And if we think back to those identity affirming spaces as being a refuge from microaggressions, what if we actually tackled the issue of those microaggressions rather than creating these safe spaces for students? we should be tackling racism on campus, homophobia on campus, rather than letting racism exist and then creating a Black student union so that folks can find community. What if we tackle the existence of the microaggression to begin with? And so I feel like I'm on the same soapbox again of how do we destigmatize from the beginning? And so collegiate recovery programs, as the programs that directly serve the students, it's a great first step, but it is not the end of the road. And I think that it's important to think about the ways that this stigma seeps into every decision or policy on campus. I used to work in admissions, for example. Well, if you calculate someone's scholarship based on their most recent GPA, how is that unfair to some people's recovery pathways, depending on when they found recovery or how many colleges they've attended before? And so I think that we sometimes see collegiate recovery programs as the answer, when really it's just the beginning. It's just the entry point with which we can start asking these harder questions of our campuses.
Yeah, I think obviously Kim and Dylan expressed so much. So I don't have a ton to add, but I think I'd love to see student voice and integrating more student feedback. As we said, like, students that are in collegiate recovery programs are inherent leaders, and they should be the ones kind of advocating for what they need. I think it's too often that a collegiate recovery coordinator is making decisions on behalf of students. And what we know is that CRPs were created to be peer support spaces. And so it should really be those people. And there's so many ways of doing this. Focus groups, just asking people. If you ask someone, hey, what do you need? Hey, how am I not meeting your needs? And acting accordingly. I think there's so many ways in which we can stop making decisions on behalf of people, but start making decisions with people, and start letting people make the decisions for themselves. I think along with that, making decisions for themselves is respecting autonomy more so than we already do, right? Stop prioritizing one form of recovery over other forms of recovery. So many forms of accessing recovery, and the ways that we choose to recovery is cultural. It's because of stigma. It's because of our lived experience and our religions, and those are so unique. And there are also so many different types of lived experiences and religions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should decenter one way of recovering and celebrate any way that someone chooses to recover, rather than saying, hey, that's not going to work for you in the long run. Right? How often do we unconsciously and sometimes silently shame someone because their recovery looks different than our recovery? We got to move away from that. It's far too prevalent in the recovery field. If you are doing what you think is best for yourself and you're learning more about yourself and your recovery every day, that should be celebrated, versus comparing it to what I choose to do as if I know better than someone else about their life. I think that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you. And one last question, maybe probably the most important question, is how can students push for buy-in from their universities to make change on their campuses related to addiction and recovery?
I'll be super quick with this one because we want to get to y'all's question and answers. I think what comes to mind for me is that the more people you have involved, the more of a force you are to be reckoned with. So I've experienced this with a university that I was so committed to collegiate recovery, and my administrators weren't as much. The more people I said, hey, we're no longer 5 students, we're 30 students, and we now have 30 professors that are also in recovery, right? So find the people on your campus that are impacted by this. There's strength in numbers. And then this is easier said than done, but bring your own funding, right? I used to have to knock on someone's door and say, can I have $200? And they would say no. There are a lot of grants out there. And one thing that SAFE does is help people find and apply for these opportunities for funding. So if you can, get access to your own source of funding, and then there is strength in numbers.
I said this at the summit, and I'll say it again. You are all leaders, and some people lead loudly and some people lead quietly. Everyone's leadership looks different. So be 100% authentically you, and whatever that looks like. If that means that you elbow your way into every table that you weren't invited to and make yourself known on campus, that's fantastic. And if that means that that's not comfortable for you and you instead empower others or work to build community and really care for each other, that's also great. I'd say find what works for you. Don't try to model yourself after a leadership style that doesn't work for you, because I think that college, as Dylan pointed out, is a time to really start to find yourself and lean into who you want to be. And I just want to echo that your campus should be blown away by the things that you're doing. If they're not, we are. So thank you all for the steps that you're taking.
Y'all, I'm going to throw a couple of links in the chat as we always do. We've got about 6 minutes, so I don't see any yet, but please continue to populate the Q&A with the questions that you have, the ways that we can be of assistance. And then as per usual, I'm putting a whole bunch of links. Of course, the post-webinar survey, please take it. It's 3 questions. How you can learn more about the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy, how you can check out the past 5 webinars. They're all public and on YouTube. Please share them. And then if you want to connect, you have questions, reach out to me and I will get you to anyone and everyone that can be of help. So I see here from Jane, has anyone worked with the Prevention Coalition, the community the college is in to help with collegiate recovery programs? I think, oh, go ahead, Kim.
I was going to say, Sid, so we don't have too much time, but Sydney, Dylan, and I just really presented on this topic at a conference for student affairs professionals. We talked about this idea of nothing about us without us, and how can prevention coalitions tap the wonderful resources of lived experience, community resources, community knowledge that students in recovery have. Sydney, I know you've actually done this work, boots on the ground. Do you want to share a little bit about what it might look like?
Yeah. I think there are many ways to do this, many ways to talk about this. I think as it pertains to prevention coalitions in the community, I think asset mapping is a great place to start, understanding who exists in your community and who do you align with values-wise, and what are the ways that they can help within prevention coalitions in the community. Is that education? Is that harm reduction, fentanyl testing strips, et cetera? If y'all don't already have a partnership, SAFE has a kind of template for asset mapping, ways that you can connect with people in the community. I think, as Kim said, our NASPA annual presentation was really how can we bridge prevention and recovery. In this case, we focused on through the use of peers. I was the person, as I think so many of us are, that does both the prevention side of the house and the recovery side of the house. And it's such a special place to be at, and how we can kind of have recovery conversations in prevention conversations. We have to stop thinking about recovery as the end of the road, right? Because what do we do in those ways is think of recovery as a consequence, a negative consequence to our actions of prevention didn't work, so here is recovery. And reality recovery is something that should be celebrated. And some of the students in recovery on campuses that I've worked with are some of the most self-aware and healthy students that I've ever worked with. So yeah, I really appreciate that question. And we'd be happy to share, send us an email after, we'd be happy to share our resources as far as bridging prevention and recovery.
And just one more sort of plug for the history of this work. If you think about that timeline of substance use in the United States and our approach to treatment and our approach to recovery, these things are evolving. I think sometimes the goal of prevention is to prevent use. And I think that in the context of human history, that might be an unrealistic goal. Can we shift the goal from preventing use? And we've talked about this before, but most people use substances to alleviate human suffering. And so the goal shouldn't be to eliminate all substance use. The goal should be to improve quality of life and reduce risk of harm. And so maybe that reset and reframe in and of itself helps us better bridge this work. And I do want to call out the question in the chat about how can you continue to make a change after you graduate? Unfortunately, Fortunately, students are their best recruiting and spokespeople for this movement, but unfortunately, they graduate and move on. And so if you can continue to be involved as an alumna or an alumni, either just retweeting or sharing something that's going on in the community or even attending events, I think that helps the folks that are in the community to continue to grow, expand, and ensure that community survives and thrives and doesn't die out as those students move on, because the recruitment process should always be ongoing. And we also know that students are students and they have finals and they have classes and they have all of these things that they're juggling. And so how can we help see that burden, stand in awe of it, and then, reach out our hands to help carry it rather than move on in our lives within reason.
Kim, I love that. I love that quote that you just referenced. Briefly, how can you continue to make changes in collegiate recovery spaces? I think, as Kim mentioned, find someone else that you can pass the torch to, right? If you have been such a wonderful steward of recovery on your campus, find someone else in your CRP or someone else who belongs to the mission and say, hey, I don't want this to die. Will you please carry this for me? That, and then also I've seen a lot of collegiate recovery programs shift into open meetings, right? So this allows for, and many of them already exist in this way, but folks that are currently students, but also people in the community, your campus can be kind of a hub for recovery in your community. How special is that? And when we promote open meetings, it allows for alum to attend and also other people in the community. And this allows you to continue to be present. Also, if your collegiate recovery community has some sort of an advocacy board, if they don't, I think that would be great. But a board of people that are kind of helping be stewards of recovery on your campus. Sometimes those are people that aren't associated with the university anymore, but have the university's best intentions in mind. Oh, good. I love to hear that collaboration with other campus organizations has worked well at Davis. Any other friends? I will be mindful it's 5 o'clock. Well, 5 o'clock on my side of the coast, but 8 o'clock for many of y'all. I'll put again the links in the chat. If you have other questions, comments, concerns, we are so available. Y'all have my email address, Kim and Dylan's email address, the campus's email address. Please reach out, particularly as you're wrapping up your impact project and the spectacular work that you've done. We are all very much here to help. So do not hesitate to send an email as we wrap up this program. As Dylan said, we're so excited to see you all in San Fran in less than a month and a half. So anyways, with that, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Kim, do you have any parting words for us?
I just want to echo something that Dylan said earlier, that it might seem odd that we decided to hold this, like, what is collegiate recovery, at the end rather than at the beginning of your experience. We didn't want it to come off as if here's what you should be doing, here's what collegiate recovery is. Again, y'all are the future of this work and you tell us what you need. This is just trying to help you see what you're doing within the context of the shoulders and giants that have come before us that we are standing on, and acknowledging who we have excluded, ways that we can do better. And I know that this field is better because of your participation in it. So thank you.
Bye, y'all.